For nearly 10 days, the Mary Celeste crossed the Atlantic without attracting unusual attention. Then, somewhere near the Azores, something happened that convinced an experienced captain to leave behind a ship that was still afloat. No distress call was sent, no evidence of violence was found. The vessel would later be discovered drifting with its cargo, valuables and personal belongings still aboard. Whatever occurred appears to have unfolded within a remarkably short period of time, leaving behind a question that has troubled investigators ever since. What could have happened during those final 27 minutes that made remaining aboard seem more dangerous than the open ocean itself? As you follow this investigation, you will examine the last known movements of the Mary Celeste, the clues recovered from the abandoned vessel, and the sequence of decisions that may have unfolded during its final moments as a manned ship. Piece by piece, the evidence leads toward a narrow window of time in which 11 people vanished from history, leaving behind a mystery that remains unsettling, not because it lacks explanations, but because none of them fully explain what happened. The ship that was found empty. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1872, the North Atlantic stretched beneath a pale winter sky, its surface broken only by wind and the slow rise and fall of distant swells. Merchant vessels crossed these waters every day, carrying cargo between continents along routes so familiar that little about them seemed mysterious anymore. Yet somewhere west of the Azores, a ship appeared on the horizon whose movements immediately felt wrong. From a distance she seemed intact. Her sails were still raised. She remained afloat. But as another crew watched her drift across the sea, they began to realize they were looking at something that should not have existed. The vessel was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine that had departed New York several weeks earlier, bound for Genoa, Italy. On board had been Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 experienced sailors. The voyage should have been routine. Nothing in the ship's known history suggested that it was destined to become one of the most enduring mysteries ever recorded at sea. Yet by the time she was sighted that December afternoon, something had happened that left no witnesses and almost no explanation. The first people to notice the ship's strange behaviour were aboard another brigantine called the Dei Gratia. Her captain, David Morehouse, was also sailing toward Europe, and had crossed paths with the Mary Celeste before. As the vessel appeared in the distance, officers aboard the Dei Gratia observed that she was not maintaining a steady course. Instead, she wandered erratically despite favourable sailing conditions. A properly managed vessel should have responded predictably to the wind. This one seemed to drift without purpose. Suspicion grew as the hours passed. Signals sent toward the Mary Celeste produced no response. No crew appeared on deck. No officer emerged to acknowledge the nearby ship. Eventually, Captain Morehouse ordered a boarding party to investigate. The decision was practical rather than dramatic. Disabled ships were not uncommon in the 19th century. Storm damage, illness, and accidents could leave a vessel temporarily abandoned or unable to communicate. Yet as the men approached and climbed aboard, they found something far stranger than a damaged ship. The Mary Celeste was empty. There were no bodies on deck, no injured sailors waiting for assistance, no captain standing watch from the quarterdeck. The boarding party moved through the vessel searching for signs of life and found none. Captain Briggs was gone. Sarah Briggs was gone. Little Sophia was gone. Every member of the crew had vanished with them. 11 people had disappeared from a ship that remained afloat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Even more unsettling was the condition of the vessel itself. The Mary Celeste had not been destroyed by a storm. Her masts were still standing. Much of her rigging remained functional. While some sails were damaged and portions of the ship showed signs of wear from rough weather, she was still capable of making progress under sail. The hull remained largely sound. There was no obvious evidence of a catastrophic collision, fire, explosion, or attack. As the inspection continued, the mystery only deepened. Inside the captain's cabin, personal belongings remained where they had been left. Valuable items had not been taken. Money and jewellery belonging to the Briggs family were still aboard. Cargo remained in the hold. If pirates had attacked the vessel, they had apparently ignored anything worth stealing. If mutiny had occurred, the mutineers had abandoned both the ship and its cargo. Neither possibility made much sense. The cargo itself consisted of more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol destined for Italy. The shipment represented a significant commercial investment and remained largely untouched. Investigators would later note that several barrels were empty, though this fact would not immediately reveal what had happened. What mattered most to the boarding party was the simple reality before them. The ship had not been stripped, looted, or wrecked. It looked as though the people aboard had departed suddenly while leaving behind nearly everything they owned. Further clues appeared throughout the vessel. A single lifeboat was missing. Certain navigational instruments were gone as well, including the ship's chronometer and sextant. The absence of these items suggested that whoever left the Mary Celeste had not expected to return, yet other details pointed in the opposite direction. Food stores remained plentiful. The crew's pipes, clothing, and personal possessions had largely been left behind. In many respects, it appeared as though everyday life aboard the vessel had been interrupted without warning. Below deck, the boarding party discovered water in the bilge. This was not unusual for a 19th century merchant ship, and the amount found aboard was not generally considered enough to threaten the vessel. Nevertheless, the discovery added another layer of uncertainty. Had those on board believed the ship was taking on dangerous amounts of water? Had they misjudged her condition? Or had some other event convinced them that remaining aboard was no longer safe? Questions multiplied with every room that was examined. Why would an experienced captain abandon a vessel that still floated securely? Why would he leave behind cargo worth a considerable sum of money? Why would he take his wife and young daughter into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Most troubling of all, why was there no evidence that anyone had attempted to return? News of the discovery spread quickly through maritime circles on both sides of the Atlantic. Empty ships had been found before, but few presented circumstances as puzzling as those surrounding the Mary Celeste. Investigators searched for explanations that fit the known evidence. Sailors proposed theories. Newspapers speculated freely. Over time, stories of sea monsters, piracy, mutiny, and supernatural forces would become attached to the vessel. Yet the facts themselves remained stubbornly simple and deeply unsettling. A seaworthy ship had been found drifting alone. Its cargo remained aboard. Its valuables remained aboard. Its passengers and crew had vanished. The sea offered no immediate answers. Long before theories began to compete for attention, the mystery started with a far more basic question. Who exactly were the 11 people who stepped aboard the Mary Celeste in New York and never reached their destination? 11 people who never reached shore. Any attempt to explain the disappearance quickly runs into a more fundamental question than how the Mary Celeste was abandoned. Before investigators can consider storms, accidents, equipment failures, or any of the theories that would emerge in the years that followed, they must first consider the people who were actually aboard the ship. Mysteries often become easier to understand once the individuals involved are examined closely. The story of the Mary Celeste moves in the opposite direction. The more historians learned about those who vanished, the harder it became to understand why none of them were ever seen again. Few contemporary accounts describe Captain Benjamin Briggs as anything other than a careful and deeply respected master mariner. Born in Massachusetts into a family connected to the sea, Briggs had spent much of his life in maritime service. By the time the Mary Celeste sailed from New York in November 1872, he had accumulated years of command experience and a reputation that colleagues regarded highly. Surviving letters and records suggest a man who approached both his profession and personal life with seriousness. He was known as a capable navigator, a disciplined captain, and a devoted family man. Nothing in the available evidence portrays him as reckless or impulsive. In later years, this aspect of his character would become one of the greatest obstacles to explaining the mystery, because many of the proposed solutions require him to make decisions that appear entirely out of step with his known reputation. Far from travelling alone, Briggs had chosen to bring the two people closest to him onto the voyage. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, accompanied him aboard the ship, along with their young daughter, Sophia Matilda Briggs, who was only 2 years old. The presence of a wife and child immediately distinguished the voyage from countless other commercial crossings of the era. Merchant vessels carried cargo, crews, and occasionally passengers, but family members were not always part of the journey. Their presence transformed the disappearance from a maritime mystery into something more personal. Whatever happened aboard the Mary Celeste did not affect only professional sailors accustomed to danger. It also affected a mother and a small child whose lives vanished into the Atlantic alongside the crew. By the standards of the 19th century merchant trade, the arrangement was not considered especially unusual or dangerous. Captains occasionally travelled with family members when circumstances allowed, particularly on routes viewed as relatively routine. The crossing planned for the Mary Celeste was not regarded as exceptionally hazardous. The vessel itself was considered capable of making the voyage, and there is little indication that Captain Briggs expected anything extraordinary to occur. In fact, surviving correspondence suggests the opposite. Letters written before departure portray ordinary concerns and expectations rather than anxiety about the journey ahead. For Briggs to place his wife and daughter aboard the vessel indicates a degree of confidence in both the ship and the voyage itself. That confidence makes later events all the more difficult to reconcile. Standing next in command was First Officer Albert G. Richardson, a sailor whose experience made him a trusted part of the vessel's leadership. Richardson had spent years at sea and possessed the qualifications expected of a senior officer on a transatlantic voyage. His responsibilities would have included navigation, supervision of crew duties, maintenance of discipline, and assisting the captain in the operation of the ship. Such positions were not given casually. Merchant shipping depended upon competence and reliability, particularly on voyages that placed vessels far from immediate assistance. Richardson's presence aboard the Mary Celeste added another experienced professional to the list of people who somehow disappeared without leaving behind a clear explanation. Across the remainder of the ship's company, the pattern was much the same. Seasoned seamen carrying out familiar crossing. Second mate Andrew Gilling was a Danish sailor who had spent much of his life working at sea. The crew also included German sailors, Volkert Lorentzen and Arian Martens, brothers Gottlieb and Bos Lorenzen, and the ship's steward Edward William Head. Together they formed a relatively small crew, typical for a merchant brigantine of the period. Although they came from different countries and backgrounds, they shared the practical experience required for Atlantic service. These were not inexperienced recruits encountering the ocean for the first time. They were working sailors whose livelihoods depended upon understanding ships, weather, and the risks that accompanied long voyages. Nowhere among the evidence recovered from the vessel did investigators find clear signs of conflict between those on board. No credible evidence pointed toward mutiny. No obvious indication suggested violence among the crew. Later theories would occasionally attempt to explain the disappearance through criminal acts or disputes aboard the vessel, but these ideas struggled against the available facts. Captain Briggs was generally respected. The officers possessed experience. The crew appeared capable and professional. While disagreements certainly occurred aboard 19th century ships, nothing discovered after the vessel's abandonment indicated the kind of breakdown that might explain the complete disappearance of everyone on board. Viewed collectively, the people aboard the Mary Celeste create a problem for nearly every straightforward explanation. If the crew had consisted of inexperienced sailors, panic might seem more plausible. If the captain had a history of poor judgment, certain decisions would be easier to understand. If evidence existed of serious tensions aboard the vessel, theories involving violence or mutiny might carry greater weight. Instead, the historical record presents a group that appears unusually stable. Experienced officers, professional sailors, a respected captain, and a family that expected to arrive safely in Europe. The basic facts surrounding the people involved seem to push against many of the simplest answers. What makes their fate so difficult to reconcile is the contrast between who they were and what ultimately happened. The disappearance was not merely a matter of a ship being found empty. It involved 11 individuals who, on paper, seemed unlikely candidates for a sudden, irrational abandonment of a seaworthy vessel. The mystery is often framed around the condition of the ship itself, yet the human element remains equally important. Every known detail about Captain Briggs and those under his command suggests people accustomed to evaluating risk carefully. They understood storms, they understood emergencies, they understood the dangers of the sea. If they chose to leave the Mary Celeste, they almost certainly believed they had a compelling reason to do so. Somewhere beyond the last ordinary days of the crossing, a sequence of events unfolded that none of them would live to describe. There was no surviving witness to explain what they saw, heard, feared, or believed. The Atlantic erased every direct account that might have solved the mystery. All that remained were fragments, names in shipping records, letters sent before departure, and the silent evidence left aboard the abandoned vessel. For generations, historians have attempted to bridge the gap between those fragments and the disappearance itself. Yet the more closely the people are examined, the more unusual the case becomes. They were not reckless adventurers chasing danger. They were ordinary individuals engaged in a routine commercial voyage, and that ordinary beginning makes their extraordinary disappearance all the more unsettling. The first clues to that sequence emerged long before the ship was discovered drifting alone in the Atlantic, a voyage across the Atlantic. Following their trail through the historical record leads not immediately to a disaster, but to a journey that appeared entirely routine. Long before the Mary Celeste became known for an unexplained disappearance, it was simply another merchant vessel preparing to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Nothing about the voyage seemed destined for historical attention. No warnings accompanied its departure, no reports described unusual conditions aboard. To those watching from shore, it was one more commercial crossing among thousands, undertaken during an era when maritime trade connected continents through wind, sail, and patience. Yet somewhere within the ordinary details of that voyage lay the beginning of a mystery that would outlive everyone involved. Crowded docks and warehouse-lined piers framed the final days of preparation before the vessel departed New York. During the 19th century, New York Harbor ranked among the busiest maritime centers in the world, with merchant ships arriving and departing continuously. Cargo moved through its waterfront districts in enormous quantities, destined for ports across Europe, South America, Africa, and beyond. The Mary Celeste joined this steady flow of commerce in early November 1872. Before departure, provisions had to be loaded, paperwork completed, cargo secured, and every aspect of the vessel prepared for a transatlantic crossing that would likely take several weeks. Such preparations were familiar routines for experienced captains and crews, and there is little evidence that the Mary Celeste attracted any unusual attention before leaving port. Beneath the decks rested a cargo whose significance would only become apparent after the ship was found abandoned. The vessel carried 1701 barrels of denatured industrial alcohol owned by a New York company and destined for Genoa, Italy. Unlike drinking alcohol, this cargo was intended for industrial use and represented a valuable commercial shipment. The barrels occupied much of the cargo hold below deck, secured for the long voyage across the Atlantic. At the time of departure, there was little reason to view the shipment as remarkable. Merchant vessels routinely transported commodities that required careful handling, and alcohol was only one among countless products moving between continents. Nevertheless, this particular cargo would later become one of the most heavily examined aspects of the entire case. Westward connections to land gradually disappeared as the brigantine pushed farther into the Atlantic. Once a vessel left the coastline behind in the 19th century, communication with the outside world effectively ended until arrival at the next port. There were no radio transmissions, no wireless updates, and no practical way to request assistance unless another vessel happened to be encountered at sea. A captain carried responsibility not only for the ship itself, but also for every decision made throughout the crossing. The ocean offered independence, but it also imposed isolation. As the Mary Celeste sailed eastward, the familiar landmarks of the American coast faded behind her, replaced by open water stretching uninterrupted toward Europe. Measured by the standards of 19th century seafaring, little about life aboard would have seemed unusual during the opening stages of the crossing. Daily routines governed nearly every aspect of shipboard existence. Watches were maintained around the clock. Navigation required regular observations and calculations. Sails needed adjustment according to changing wind conditions. Equipment demanded inspection and maintenance. Meals were prepared, logs updated, and duties carried out according to established schedules. Captain Briggs oversaw these operations while travelling with Sarah and young Sophia, who occupied a unique position aboard a vessel otherwise devoted to commerce. Although records cannot reveal the details of their daily conversations or activities, the available evidence suggests a voyage proceeding according to familiar maritime patterns, rather than under extraordinary circumstances. Changing skies and shifting seas accompanied the vessel as it moved through the North Atlantic in late autumn. November crossings required caution because weather conditions could change rapidly across vast stretches of ocean. Mariners expected periods of rough seas, strong winds, and unsettled conditions during this season. Yet experienced captains also understood that such challenges were part of normal Atlantic navigation. Surviving information does not indicate that the Mary Celeste encountered any singularly catastrophic storm during the early portion of the voyage. Like countless other vessels crossing the Atlantic that autumn, she appears to have continued eastward through a mixture of weather conditions that demanded skill and attention, but did not necessarily signal danger. With each passing day, the world beyond the ship became more distant and more difficult to reach. This growing separation from land carried practical consequences. Every decision increasingly depended upon those aboard. Every observation became more important. Mariners of the era relied on celestial navigation, charts, instruments, and experience to determine their position and maintain course. Errors could have serious consequences, particularly near coastlines, islands, or hazardous waters. For much of the voyage, however, the Atlantic offered immense open space where ships could travel for days without encountering another vessel. The Mary Celeste moved through this environment largely alone, accompanied only by the routines of the voyage and the endless horizon surrounding her. Near the middle of the ocean route stood the Azores, a familiar landmark for mariners navigating between continents. This Portuguese archipelago, located in the North Atlantic, occupied an important position along many shipping routes. Sailors crossing between North America and Europe often passed near the islands, using them as reference points during navigation. By late November, the Mary Celeste had progressed toward this region of the Atlantic. The islands themselves were not unusual destinations for maritime attention. Generations of sailors had observed them while crossing the ocean, yet their location would later become significant because it placed the vessel near the area where the historical record begins to narrow dramatically. Surviving evidence from the voyage offers surprisingly few indications that anything was seriously wrong. This absence of warning is one of the most striking features of the case. Historians studying maritime disasters often encounter reports of worsening weather, mechanical failures, crew disputes, navigational problems, or other developments that foreshadow later events. The Mary Celeste presents no such clear progression. The available information suggests a vessel continuing its voyage while carrying out normal operations. No confirmed records describe panic aboard. No verified accounts indicate mutiny, violence, or immediate crisis. Instead, the ship appears to move steadily through the Atlantic while leaving behind only scattered traces of its progress. Gradually, the available sources become narrower, quieter, and far more important to the mystery. As the voyage continued, the broad context of the crossing gave way to a smaller collection of surviving documents and observations. Historians attempting to reconstruct events must rely heavily on these limited records because they represent some of the last direct evidence created by those aboard the vessel. Every notation carries significance. Every recorded position becomes a point of reference. The closer the narrative moves toward the disappearance itself, the fewer reliable sources remain. Eventually, the mystery stops being defined by what is known and becomes defined by what is missing. Among those surviving records was a brief notation that would later draw extraordinary attention from investigators and historians alike. The last entry in the logbook. Preserved inside the ship's journal was a final trace of certainty before the mystery begins to deepen. Much of what is known about the Mary Celeste comes from evidence discovered after the vessel was found abandoned, but a ship's log offers something different. It provides a direct connection to the people who were still aboard while events were unfolding. Every entry represents a moment when someone observed the sea, recorded a position, noted the weather, and continued with the ordinary responsibilities of navigation. For the Mary Celeste, those routine observations eventually narrow to a single surviving point, beyond which the voices of the ship's occupants effectively disappear. Late in the month, the Mary Celeste was approaching waters that countless Atlantic mariners had navigated before her. By November 25, 1872, the vessel had travelled a considerable distance from New York and was nearing the Azores, a Portuguese archipelago that served as a familiar landmark along transatlantic routes. Ships moving between North America and Europe often passed through this region, using the islands as useful reference points during navigation. Nothing about the location itself suggested danger. It was not an isolated corner of the ocean unknown to sailors. Instead, it lay along a well-travelled maritime corridor where merchant vessels had crossed safely for generations. Every merchant captain understood that a properly maintained logbook served as both a navigational tool and an official record of the voyage. Entries documented position, course, weather conditions, sail changes, and other observations considered important to the operation of the ship. In an era before modern communication, these records carried tremendous value. They helped captains track progress, provided evidence of decisions made during the voyage, and created a written account that could later be consulted if questions arose. Because of this role, logbooks tended to focus on practical information rather than personal reflection. They recorded what needed to be known, not necessarily what future generations might wish to know. Written into those pages was a snapshot of the ship's circumstances that appeared unremarkable when it was first entered. The final logbook entry associated with the Mary Celeste was dated November 25th, 1872. It placed the vessel near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. Historians and investigators have examined this notation repeatedly because it represents the last confirmed record created by those aboard before the mystery begins. At the time it was written, however, there was little reason to believe the entry would become historically significant. It was simply another routine notation made during a commercial voyage that seemed to be progressing toward its destination. Missing from the surviving notation, however, are many of the warning signs investigators might have expected to find. There was no recorded declaration of emergency, no mention of panic among the crew, no indication that Captain Briggs believed the ship faced an immediate threat. The entry does not describe violent weather, catastrophic damage, or circumstances that obviously foreshadow abandonment. This absence of alarm has become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. In retrospect, people often search for clues pointing toward a disaster, yet the final surviving record offers remarkably little evidence that those aboard believed anything extraordinary was about to occur. Position, course, and recent progress all suggested a vessel continuing toward its destination rather than away from it. The recorded location placed the Mary Celeste relatively close to the Azores compared with the vast distance already covered since leaving New York. Genoa remained ahead, but the voyage had advanced substantially. For an experienced captain such as Benjamin Briggs, this stage of the crossing would have represented continued movement toward a successful arrival rather than a moment of obvious crisis. The available information suggests a ship operating within expected parameters, rather than one drifting helplessly through the Atlantic. Looking carefully at the available facts reveals a moment that seems surprisingly ordinary for a ship nearing the centre of an enduring mystery. The crew would likely have remained occupied with the same responsibilities that governed every day at sea. Navigation required continual attention, equipment required maintenance, watches had to be stood regardless of weather or location. Sarah Briggs and young Sophia remained aboard, accompanying the captain during a voyage that still appeared to be unfolding normally. Although the historical record cannot recreate the exact atmosphere aboard the vessel on that day, nothing within the surviving evidence clearly separates it from the many ordinary days that preceded it. Researchers continue to return to this record because it marks the last point at which events can be observed directly rather than inferred. Before November 25th, the voyage exists within a framework of documented evidence. There are records of departure, information regarding the cargo, and entries showing the ship's progress across the Atlantic. The final logbook notation serves as the endpoint of that chain. Beyond it, certainty begins to diminish. Historians can analyze evidence, compare timelines, and evaluate theories, but they can no longer rely upon direct observations recorded by those aboard. The surviving documents simply stop. Everything that follows emerges from a far less certain landscape of evidence. This distinction is crucial because the mystery of the Mary Celeste is often shaped as much by what is missing as by what survives. Investigators possess an abandoned ship, scattered physical clues, and a final recorded position. What they do not possess are the observations that would normally bridge the gap between the last logbook entry and the vessel's eventual discovery. There are no later journal entries, no surviving letters, no witness accounts from the crew. The normal flow of information abruptly ends. Here, the documented story effectively reaches its final solid footing before giving way to speculation and reconstruction. Historians know where the ship was when the entry was made. They know the vessel continued to exist afterward because it was eventually discovered adrift. They know the people aboard vanished sometime between those 2 points. Yet the transition from one reality to the other remains hidden behind a wall of missing evidence. The final logbook entry does not solve the mystery. If anything, its ordinary nature deepens it. The closer investigators look at the last known record, the more difficult it becomes to identify a clear path from routine maritime operations to complete abandonment. From this point forward, the mystery unfolds across a stretch of time that left almost nothing behind. 9 days that left no record. After the final notation was made, the historical trail enters one of the most elusive periods in maritime history. For much of the Mary Celeste story, investigators can point to something tangible: a ship, a crew, a cargo manifest, a departure date, or a surviving entry in the vessel's records. Then, almost without warning, those points of reference disappear. The ship continues to exist. The people aboard continue to exist. The voyage itself continues. Yet the evidence becomes strangely silent. What remains is not a dramatic account of disaster, but a span of time in which events unfolded beyond the reach of any surviving witness. Nearly a week and a half separates the last confirmed record from the moment the Mary Celeste reappears in the evidence. The final known logbook entry was made on November 25, 1872. The vessel was discovered abandoned by the crew of the Dei Gratia on December 5th. Between those dates lies approximately 9 days that have resisted complete reconstruction for more than a century. Historians know where the story stands at the beginning of that interval and where it stands at the end. What remains uncertain is everything that happened in between. The most important chapter of the mystery occupies a period for which no direct narrative survives. Geography provides one of the few reliable clues available during this otherwise undocumented stretch of time. The final recorded position placed the Mary Celeste near the Azores, while the ship was eventually found east of those islands. This means the vessel continued moving after the last log entry was written. It did not simply stop in the water when the record ended. Winds, currents, and sail power carried it onward through the Atlantic. Although investigators can estimate portions of that movement, geography reveals only the broad outline of the journey. It cannot explain what decisions were made aboard, who made them, or why the voyage ultimately ended in abandonment. Far out on the Atlantic, conditions continued to change whether anyone recorded them or not. The ocean did not pause simply because the evidence became scarce. Weather systems moved across the region, winds shifted, waves rose and fell, clouds gathered and dispersed. Day turned to night and back again. Merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic were accustomed to adapting continuously to such conditions, making adjustments as circumstances required. What makes the Mary Celeste unusual is not that these forces existed, but that no surviving account describes how those aboard responded to them during this crucial period. Absent from the case are the kinds of accounts that normally allow historians to follow events as they unfold. Maritime investigations often benefit from witness testimony, later journal entries, communications from nearby vessels, or reports generated during emergencies. None of those sources exist here. No crew member survived to tell the story. No later records have ever been discovered. No passing ship reported a crisis involving the Mary Celeste during those missing days. Historians are therefore confronted with a rare problem. A major event clearly occurred, yet almost nobody observed it, and those who did left no surviving testimony behind. Routine responsibilities almost certainly remained part of life aboard for at least some portion of the interval. Ships do not operate themselves. Navigation required attention, sails required management, equipment required inspection, meals needed to be prepared, watches had to be maintained throughout the day and night. While it is impossible to determine exactly how long normal routines continued after the final logbook entry, there is little reason to assume that ordinary shipboard life immediately ceased. At some point during these missing days, the Mary Celeste still functioned as a working vessel carrying a captain, crew, cargo and family toward Europe. The challenge lies in determining when that normality began to break down. Scattered across the ocean ahead of the vessel were islands that had long served as navigational reference points for transatlantic sailors. The Azores occupied an important position along many shipping routes and were well known to mariners crossing between continents. Their presence meant that the Mary Celeste was no longer traversing the most remote stretches of the Atlantic. Land existed within the broader region, and other vessels occasionally passed through nearby waters. Yet proximity to known landmarks did not necessarily guarantee safety or understanding. The mystery did not unfold in an unexplored wilderness, but in a part of the ocean that generations of sailors had successfully navigated before. Indirect evidence has therefore become the primary tool for anyone attempting to understand this period. Investigators have studied distances, weather records, maritime practices, navigation routes, and the vessel's later condition. in an effort to reconstruct what may have occurred. Such methods can narrow possibilities, but they cannot replace first-hand observations. Every conclusion remains limited by the same fundamental problem. The people who experienced those days left no surviving account of them. As a result, reconstruction becomes an exercise in identifying what was possible rather than proving what actually happened. Hidden somewhere within these unrecorded days is the moment that transformed an ordinary voyage into an enduring mystery. At the beginning of the interval, the Mary Celeste remained a functioning merchant vessel progressing toward its destination. By the end, it had become an abandoned ship drifting across the Atlantic without a single person aboard. That transformation is the central event of the entire case. Whatever decision was made, whatever concern arose, or whatever circumstance developed, it occurred during this period. The disappearance itself does not belong to the voyage before November 25th, nor does it belong to the discovery on December 5th. It belongs to the undocumented space between them. Few gaps in maritime history have generated as much investigation while yielding so few definitive answers. Historians have spent generations examining records, studying evidence, and testing explanations against known facts. Yet the missing interval remains stubbornly resistant to certainty. The problem is not merely that information is limited, it is that the most critical events occurred precisely where the evidence is weakest. Every theory eventually encounters the same barrier: 9 days during which the people aboard vanished from the historical record. The mystery survives because those days survive as little more than an outline, their details erased by time and the sea. The next clues emerge not from new records, but from the condition in which the vessel itself was eventually found. The strange condition of the Mary Celeste. Unlike the missing interval itself, the abandoned vessel still had a story to tell. The 9 days between the final logbook entry and the discovery of the Mary Celeste left almost no direct evidence behind, but the ship itself remained. Every room, compartment, and piece of equipment offered the possibility of insight into what had happened. Investigators could no longer rely on eyewitness accounts or surviving records. Instead, they were forced to examine the physical condition of the vessel and ask whether the clues left behind pointed toward danger, caution, confusion, or something else entirely. The challenge was that the evidence rarely seemed to point in the same direction. Boarding parties searching for answers encountered a ship that defied many expectations associated with maritime disaster. The Mary Celeste was not a shattered wreck barely clinging to the surface. Her hull remained afloat, her masts were standing. Although some sails were damaged and portions of the rigging showed wear, the vessel was still capable of sailing. Water had entered the ship, but not in quantities that immediately suggested a sinking vessel. To those who first stepped aboard, the most striking feature was not destruction, but contradiction. The ship appeared abandoned, yet it did not appear lost. Investigators quickly realized that the vessel's condition might reveal more than any surviving document. As they moved through the ship, they found evidence of wear and exposure that was consistent with weeks at sea, but not with a catastrophic event. Some sails were damaged or improperly set, and portions of the rigging required attention. A hatch cover was reported to be displaced, and seawater had entered parts of the vessel. Yet none of these observations suggested a ship moments away from destruction. The Mary Celeste appeared weathered rather than crippled, creating an uncomfortable contrast between the condition of the vessel and the complete disappearance of the people responsible for operating it. The captain's quarters attracted particular attention because they represented one of the few places aboard where personal decisions might leave traces. Investigators found many of the ordinary belongings associated with life at sea still present. Clothing, furniture, and personal effects remained where they would be expected. The atmosphere was not one of deliberate abandonment in anticipation of a long absence. Instead, the cabins conveyed the impression that those who had occupied them expected to return. For later investigators, this impression became difficult to ignore. People fleeing a vessel forever often take what they can carry. The occupants of the Mary Celeste appeared to have left much of their lives behind. Elsewhere aboard the ship, commercial papers associated with the voyage helped reinforce the same conclusion. Documents relating to the cargo remained on board, as did many records connected to the operation of the vessel. Their presence mattered because merchant voyages depended heavily on paperwork. Cargo manifests, shipping records, and other documents represented both financial value and practical necessity. Had the abandonment been carefully planned long in advance, investigators might reasonably expect more of these materials to be missing. Instead, the ship contained many of the items one would expect to find aboard a vessel whose voyage had been unexpectedly interrupted. Remaining beneath the hatches was the very cargo the Mary Celeste had been carrying toward Genoa. More than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol were still present in the hold. This fact quickly drew attention because valuable cargo often disappears when piracy, theft, or deliberate seizure occurs. Yet the cargo had not been removed. Later inspections revealed that several barrels were empty, though investigators eventually concluded that the barrels in question were made from porous red oak rather than the white oak used for most of the shipment. Such barrels were known to leak through evaporation over time. Whatever significance this detail may or may not have held, the broader reality remained unchanged. The cargo that had motivated the voyage remained largely where it had been loaded in New York. Left undisturbed throughout much of the vessel were items whose presence raised immediate questions about what had not occurred. Money belonging to Captain Briggs and personal valuables associated with those aboard had not disappeared. Jewellery remained untouched. Commercial documents connected to the cargo were still present. If criminals had boarded the ship with the intention of stealing valuables, they had apparently ignored obvious opportunities. This absence of theft complicated many of the theories that emerged after the vessel's discovery. While not impossible, robbery seemed difficult to reconcile with the evidence left behind. Signs of recent human activity lingered throughout the ship despite the complete absence of the people themselves. Clothing remained aboard. Personal possessions had not been packed away. Everyday items could still be found in places where they would normally be used. Accounts describing the condition of the vessel vary in certain details, particularly regarding food and meal preparation, but the broader impression remained consistent. The ship did not appear to have been abandoned after a prolonged period of deterioration. Instead, investigators encountered an environment suggesting that normal life aboard had been interrupted rather than gradually brought to an orderly conclusion. Most striking of all was a piece of equipment that was no longer where it should have been. The ship's lifeboat was missing. Unlike many other clues, this absence pointed toward deliberate action. Lifeboats do not simply vanish without explanation. Their disappearance suggested that at least some of those aboard had left the vessel intentionally rather than being swept away by a sudden catastrophe. Yet the missing boat introduced new questions rather than providing answers. Why would experienced sailors abandon a ship that remained afloat? What circumstances could persuade Captain Briggs to leave behind a vessel that still appeared capable of remaining at sea? The missing lifeboat became one of the strongest indications that a conscious decision had been made somewhere during those undocumented days. Missing alongside the vessel's occupants were instruments essential to navigation at sea. Investigators determined that the ship's chronometer and sextant were not aboard when the Mary Celeste was discovered. These instruments were crucial for determining position during long voyages. Their absence mattered because they were precisely the sort of equipment someone would take if they expected to continue navigating after leaving the ship. This detail distinguished the disappearance from scenarios involving sudden destruction. If the crew had been overwhelmed without warning, there would have been little opportunity to collect navigational tools. Their absence suggested preparation, however limited that preparation may have been. Inspection of the lower portions of the ship revealed details that later investigators would scrutinize closely. Water was present in the bilge, the lowest area inside the hull where such accumulation naturally occurred. Reports indicated that approximately 3.5 feet of water had collected there. While this sounds alarming to modern ears, vessels of the era often carried water in the bilge without immediate danger. The amount found aboard the Mary Celeste was not generally considered sufficient to sink the ship. Nevertheless, it attracted attention because it raised the possibility that those aboard may have believed the vessel was taking on more water than it actually was. Investigators also noted irregularities involving the ship's pump records. One sounding related to the bilge had been entered in a way that later became a subject of discussion, suggesting that conditions below deck may have received unusual attention during the final phase of the voyage. What complicated the interpretation of the bilge water was the difficulty of evaluating such conditions aboard a 19th century sailing vessel. Modern observers often imagine captains possessing immediate and accurate information about the state of their ships, but this was not always the case. Measurements required manual inspection, judgment, and experience. Small errors in observation could produce very different conclusions about the seriousness of a situation. If Captain Briggs believed the water level was rising faster than it actually was, or if pump problems prevented him from verifying conditions confidently, uncertainty itself could become a significant factor in decision-making. For many historians, this distinction remains important. The evidence does not necessarily suggest that the Mary Celeste was in immediate danger of sinking. Instead, it raises the possibility that those aboard feared a danger that could not be fully assessed. Maritime history contains numerous examples of captains making cautious decisions when confronted with incomplete information. The challenge in the Mary Celeste case is determining whether such caution eventually crossed the line into a decision whose consequences proved far greater than the threat that inspired it. Equally intriguing was the disappearance of a tool associated with measuring conditions inside the vessel. The sounding rod used to determine water levels in the bilge was not found aboard when the ship was examined. On its own, this might seem insignificant. Combined with the questions surrounding the bilge water and pump records, however, it became another piece of a growing puzzle. If someone had recently used the sounding rod to evaluate conditions below deck, its absence might indicate that it had been taken into the lifeboat along with other equipment. Historians have debated the significance of this possibility for decades. While no single clue provides a definitive answer, the sounding rod became one more indication that concerns about the ship's condition may have played a role in events. Viewed individually, many of these clues appear straightforward enough. Cargo remaining aboard suggests the ship was not looted. Valuables left behind suggest theft was not a primary motive. Missing navigational instruments suggest preparation. The absent lifeboat suggests intentional departure. Water in the bilge suggests a potential concern, though perhaps not an immediate emergency. The problem is that each clue seems to support a different interpretation. Some point toward caution, others point toward confidence. Some imply urgency, others imply a measured response. Rarely do they converge into a single obvious explanation. Placed beside one another, however, they produce a picture filled with contradictions rather than clarity. The Mary Celeste appears to have been abandoned, yet not because it was clearly sinking. Important equipment was taken, yet many valuable possessions remained. The ship carried signs of concern, yet not necessarily signs of catastrophe. The evidence suggests that those aboard acted with purpose, but the reasoning behind that purpose remains elusive. Investigators examining the vessel found enough clues to challenge simple explanations, yet not enough to establish exactly what had happened. In this sense, the condition of the ship mirrors the mystery itself. Every answer seems to generate another question. The challenge now was determining how those scattered pieces might fit into the final moments before the ship was abandoned. 27 minutes before everyone vanished. Reconstructing the disappearance means arranging scattered clues into a sequence that no witness survived to describe. The evidence recovered from the Mary Celeste does not provide a complete narrative, nor does it reveal exactly what happened during the final phase of the voyage. What it does provide are fragments, missing equipment, concerns about the bilge, an absent lifeboat, untouched valuables, and a ship still capable of remaining afloat. On their own, these clues are difficult to interpret. Taken together, however, they allow investigators to outline a plausible chain of events. Not a certainty, but a reconstruction built from the strongest evidence available. Deep within the vessel, attention may have focused on a problem that was difficult to evaluate with complete certainty. Water had accumulated in the bilge, and later examinations showed that the ship's pumps may not have been functioning as expected. Investigators eventually discovered that one of the pumps was disassembled when the vessel was found. This detail has attracted significant attention because a captain relying on faulty or incomplete information about water levels could easily face uncertainty regarding the ship's condition. The bilge itself was hidden from direct observation. Determining how much water had accumulated required measurements, equipment, and interpretation. If those systems were producing confusing information, concern could begin to grow long before any immediate danger became visible on deck. Caution, rather than panic, provides the most plausible starting point for understanding the actions that followed. Nothing found aboard suggests a crew responding to sudden catastrophe. There was no widespread destruction, no signs of violence, no indication that people had rushed frantically from one end of the vessel to the other. Captain Benjamin Briggs was known for careful judgment, and the available evidence fits more comfortably with a gradual escalation of concern than with a spontaneous act of fear. If he became worried about the condition of the ship, it was likely because he believed there were reasonable grounds for that concern, not because he had abandoned caution or discipline. Adding to the uncertainty was the nature of the cargo secured below the deck planking. The Mary Celeste carried more than 1,600 barrels of industrial alcohol, a cargo capable of producing vapour under certain conditions. Several barrels were later found empty, though investigators generally attributed this to leakage through porous wood, rather than catastrophic failure. Nevertheless, those aboard the ship would not have possessed the benefit of hindsight. If unusual odours, sounds, or signs of leakage emerge from below deck, they may have been difficult to interpret. A captain confronting uncertainty about both water levels and cargo conditions could find himself managing risks that were not easily measured or verified. Compounding the problem was the limited information available to sailors operating far from immediate assistance. A modern captain confronted with uncertainty can often consult instruments, communication systems, and outside expertise. Benjamin Briggs possessed none of those advantages. Every judgment had to be formed from what could be observed aboard the vessel itself. If conflicting signs were emerging from different parts of the ship, there would be no distant authority capable of confirming which interpretation was correct. The responsibility for deciding whether conditions were safe rested entirely with the people already aboard. Maritime decision-making often revolves around uncertainty rather than certainty. Captains are rarely forced to choose between obvious safety and obvious danger. More often, they must act before the situation fully reveals itself. Waiting too long can transform a manageable problem into a catastrophe, while acting too early can create risks of its own. Historians examining the Mary Celeste have frequently noted that the available evidence appears consistent with a captain attempting to make a cautious decision in the absence of complete information. Such decisions are among the most difficult a mariner can face because they require balancing known conditions against dangers that may only exist in possibility. Gradually, the situation may have become less about visible danger and more about the possibility of unseen danger. This distinction is important because many maritime emergencies present obvious signs. Fire can be seen, structural damage can often be identified, severe flooding eventually becomes visible. The strongest reconstructions of the Mary Celeste case suggest a different scenario. Rather than responding to disaster itself, those aboard may have been responding to the fear of a disaster they believed was developing out of sight. In such circumstances, uncertainty becomes a powerful force. Decisions are no longer based solely on what is known, but also on what might be happening beyond immediate observation. Preparations consistent with a temporary evacuation begin to emerge from the surviving evidence. The missing lifeboat remains one of the clearest indicators that departure from the ship was intentional. Yet the condition of the vessel suggests that those leaving did not necessarily believe they were abandoning it forever. Had Captain Briggs concluded that the ship was moments away from sinking, one might expect different patterns in the evidence. Instead, many investigators have noted that the available clues appear more consistent with precaution than surrender. The lifeboat may have been prepared not because the Mary Celeste was already lost, but because those aboard believed they might soon need a safer position from which to assess the situation. Even the practical realities of launching a lifeboat suggest a process rather than a panic. Lowering a boat, gathering people, and preparing essential equipment required time and coordination. Nothing in the surviving evidence indicates that the occupants were forced overboard by a sudden event that left no opportunity for thought. Instead, the clues point toward deliberate action. Whether that action took only minutes or somewhat longer cannot be known, but it appears to have involved planning rather than impulse. This distinction helps explain why the mystery remains so compelling. If the Mary Celeste had clearly suffered catastrophic damage, the abandonment would be easier to understand. The enduring puzzle lies in the possibility that experienced sailors may have left a vessel that still seemed capable of carrying them safely across the Atlantic. The decision becomes less mysterious if viewed as temporary, yet more mysterious when considering how completely it separated them from the ship they apparently intended to preserve. Crucially, several missing items indicate that those leaving the ship expected to continue navigating afterward. The chronometer and sextant were gone. These instruments would have been essential for determining position at sea. Their absence strongly suggests that whoever departed the vessel intended to retain some ability to navigate rather than simply drift aimlessly. The missing sounding rod may point in a similar direction. Together, these items create the impression of a group taking practical steps for survival. Such actions imply planning, however brief that planning may have been. They do not resemble the desperate response one would expect from people fleeing an immediate catastrophe with only seconds to spare. At some point, the occupants of the Mary Celeste appear to have crossed a threshold from concern to action. The exact moment cannot be identified, but the evidence suggests that a decision was eventually reached. Captain Briggs, Sarah Briggs, young Sophia and the crew left the ship. Whether they entered the lifeboat all at once or in stages remains unknown. What matters is that an experienced captain apparently concluded that remaining aboard carried greater risk than leaving. This decision stands at the centre of the entire mystery because it requires explaining not only what those aboard feared, but also why they considered the alternative preferable. Strangely, many of the vessel's most important characteristics remained unchanged throughout this process. The Mary Celeste was still afloat, the cargo remained aboard, valuables were left behind, the ship retained the ability to sail. These facts create one of the strongest contradictions in maritime history. Most abandonments occur because a vessel is clearly becoming uninhabitable or unsalvageable. Here, the evidence suggests that departure occurred before any such outcome became obvious. The people aboard acted as though a serious threat existed, yet the ship they left behind continued drifting across the Atlantic for days without them. Central to one of the strongest reconstructions is the possibility that the ship was never meant to be abandoned permanently. Some researchers have suggested that the lifeboat may have remained connected to the vessel by a line. In this scenario, those aboard could temporarily move away from the ship while maintaining the ability to return once the perceived danger passed. Such a decision would help explain several otherwise puzzling details. It would explain why valuables remained aboard. It would explain why navigational instruments were taken. Most importantly, it would explain why an experienced captain might leave a vessel that still appeared seaworthy. The intention may never have been to leave the Mary Celeste behind. The intention may have been to stay close to it while avoiding a danger that was believed to be immediate but temporary. Ocean conditions can turn manageable separations into irreversible ones in a remarkably short period of time. A line can fail, wind can shift, a vessel under sail can begin moving away faster than expected. Even a small increase in distance becomes significant when one craft is much larger and more difficult to maneuver than the other. If separation occurred under such circumstances, the consequences would have been devastating. The Mary Celeste could continue moving through the Atlantic, while those who had left it struggled to regain contact. The further the ship drifted away, the less likely recovery became. What began as a temporary precaution could transform within minutes into a permanent disaster. Beyond that stage, the evidence becomes too fragmentary to support anything more than careful inference. No surviving record describes whether the crew watched the ship disappear into the distance. No witness explains whether attempts were made to reconnect with the vessel. The reconstruction reaches its limit at the moment separation becomes irreversible. Everything beyond that point vanishes into the same silence that has surrounded the case for more than a century. What remains is a sequence of events that fits many of the known clues without requiring panic, mutiny, piracy, or supernatural explanations. Yet even this reconstruction cannot be proven. It remains an effort to understand how rational decisions, made by experienced people, might have produced one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. Whatever happened next unfolded far from the safety of the vessel they had chosen to leave behind, the lifeboat that became a death sentence. If the reconstruction is even partially correct, the most dangerous part of the story began only after the ship was left behind. Up to this point, the mystery has centered on decisions made aboard the Mary Celeste and the clues discovered after it was found adrift. Yet those clues only explain how 11 people may have ended up in a lifeboat. They do not explain what happened afterward. Once the occupants left the relative safety of the brigantine, the circumstances change completely. The evidence becomes thinner, the possibilities broader, and the Atlantic itself takes on a far greater role in determining the outcome. Compared with the vessel they had departed, a lifeboat offered little protection against the scale of the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste was built to cross oceans. It carried supplies, shelter, navigational resources, and the stability of a much larger hull. A lifeboat, by contrast, existed primarily as an emergency craft. Even under favourable conditions, it was never intended to replace the vessel from which it came. The difference in scale mattered enormously. A brigantine could withstand conditions that might quickly become dangerous for a small open boat. Whatever confidence those aboard may have felt while standing on the deck of the Mary Celeste would have changed the moment they found themselves separated from it. Maintaining contact with the Mary Celeste may have become the defining challenge of the occupants' survival. Many modern interpretations of the case suggest that Captain Briggs never intended to abandon the vessel permanently. The missing navigational instruments, the valuables left behind, and the otherwise orderly condition of the ship all point toward a temporary measure rather than a final departure. If that interpretation is correct, remaining close to the vessel would have been essential. The ship represented safety, supplies, and a means of reaching land. The lifeboat represented only a short-term alternative. Everything may have depended upon keeping the larger vessel within reach. Across open water, even modest environmental forces can alter the outcome of a situation dramatically. The North Atlantic is shaped by shifting winds, changing seas, and powerful currents that operate independently of human intentions. A small boat and a sailing vessel do not respond to those forces in exactly the same way. Variations in wind direction, sail position, or sea conditions can gradually increase the distance between two craft, even when neither party intends it. What begins as a manageable separation may become a serious problem before those involved fully recognize the danger. At sea, distance often grows more quickly than it can be reduced. Support for a towing arrangement comes from the evidence as well as from practical maritime considerations. One long-standing theory proposes that the lifeboat remained connected to the Mary Celeste by a line after the occupants left the vessel. Such an arrangement would make sense if the goal was temporary evacuation. Those aboard could move away from a perceived danger while maintaining a link to the ship itself. A captain concerned about conditions below deck, uncertain about water levels, or worried about cargo-related risks might view such a precaution as reasonable. The theory cannot be proven, but it provides a framework that helps explain why an experienced mariner would leave a ship that remained afloat. Should that connection have failed, the consequences would have unfolded quickly. A parted rope requires no dramatic catastrophe. Lines wear, strain, and break. Sudden tension created by waves or changes in relative movement can place enormous stress on maritime equipment. If the lifeboat became detached from the Mary Celeste, the occupants would immediately face a very different situation from the one they expected. Instead of remaining near the vessel, they would find themselves dependent upon their own limited resources. Re-establishing contact could become difficult or impossible, particularly if environmental conditions favoured the movement of the larger ship. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the case is that nobody immediately knew the occupants were gone. In the modern world, the disappearance of a vessel often triggers communication failures, distress signals, or coordinated search efforts. The 19th century Atlantic operated differently. If the lifeboat separated from the Mary Celeste, there would have been no immediate alarm. No rescue service would have been dispatched. No nearby authorities would have known that 11 people were in trouble. The occupants could disappear without anyone realizing a disaster had occurred. By the time the Mary Celeste was discovered, whatever had happened to those who left it had already unfolded beyond recovery. Survival in a small open boat depended upon factors very different from those governing life aboard a merchant ship. Exposure became more significant. Protection from weather became more limited. Supplies would have been restricted compared with what remained aboard the brigantine. Navigation, even with instruments, would become more difficult. A small craft offered fewer options and less margin for error. The Atlantic did not need to produce an extraordinary storm to create danger. Prolonged exposure, changing conditions, and simple misfortune could become serious threats over time. The occupants may have entered the lifeboat believing the arrangement would be temporary. If so, they may never have intended to endure a prolonged separation from the ship. Recovering people or debris from the Atlantic has always presented enormous difficulties. The ocean covers an immense area, and evidence can disappear quickly. Objects drift. Weather alters conditions. Searches often begin with incomplete information regarding locations and timelines. Even when modern technology is available, maritime disappearances frequently leave limited physical traces behind. In the 19th century, the challenge was even greater. If the occupants of the lifeboat were lost at sea, the chances of later recovery would have been extremely small. The absence of bodies or identifiable debris does not necessarily indicate an unusual outcome. It reflects the reality of the environment in which the disappearance occurred. Remarkably, the ship survived the mystery, while the people at the centre of it disappeared completely. The Mary Celeste continued drifting across the Atlantic long enough to be encountered by the Dei Gracia. It preserved clues, records, and physical evidence that investigators could later examine. The occupants left no equivalent record behind. The ship became a witness. The people became an absence. This imbalance has shaped every discussion of the case ever since. Historians can study the vessel in detail, yet they remain largely unable to follow the experiences of those who stepped away from it. From this point onward, the trail leads away from the vessel and into the efforts to explain what had occurred. Once the Mary Celeste reached port and authorities began examining the circumstances of its discovery, the mystery entered a new phase. The focus shifted from survival to explanation. Questions that had once belonged to sailors and captains became questions for investigators, officials, and courts. Yet the evidence they inherited would prove no less contradictory than the ship itself. Every clue seemed capable of supporting more than one interpretation, and every explanation appeared to leave important questions unanswered. What investigators inherited was not a solved disaster, but a collection of clues that seemed to point in different directions at once. The investigations that solved nothing. With the occupants gone and the vessel recovered, attention shifted to a different kind of search altogether. The mystery no longer unfolded on the Atlantic Ocean, but in offices, courtrooms, and official inquiries where authorities attempted to determine what had happened aboard the Mary Celeste. The ship itself had survived. Its crew had not. What remained were scattered clues, contradictory evidence, and a growing public fascination with a case that seemed to resist ordinary explanation. Investigators faced a difficult task from the beginning. They possessed a vessel, a cargo, and an abandoned voyage, but they lacked the one thing that might have solved the mystery immediately: testimony from those who had been there. Upon reaching Gibraltar, the Mary Celeste entered a world of paperwork, testimony, and official scrutiny. Under maritime law, abandoned vessels recovered at sea became subjects of salvage proceedings. The crew of the Dei Gratia, having found and brought the Mary Celeste safely to port, expected compensation for their efforts. Such proceedings were routine in principle, but the unusual condition of the vessel quickly ensured that this case would be anything but routine. Before salvage claims could be settled, authorities wanted answers. Why had the ship been abandoned? What had happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and the crew? And perhaps most importantly, could the evidence be trusted at all? Questions began to accumulate almost as quickly as the evidence could be catalogued. Officials examined the vessel, reviewed documents, and interviewed those involved in its discovery. The circumstances immediately appeared suspicious. Ships were occasionally found deserted, but rarely under conditions quite like these. The Mary Celeste remained afloat. Valuable cargo was still aboard. Personal possessions had been left behind, yet 11 people had vanished. Every attempt to explain one aspect of the case seemed to create new problems elsewhere. The more investigators looked, the more difficult it became to fit the available facts into a coherent narrative. Skepticism found its strongest voice in Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood. As Gibraltar's Attorney General, Flood played a central role in the inquiry, and from the outset he approached the case with considerable suspicion. He was unconvinced that the disappearance resulted from a straightforward maritime accident. Instead, he searched aggressively for signs of criminal activity. Flood examined evidence, questioned witnesses, and pursued possibilities that ranged from fraud to murder. His determination shaped much of the investigation and influenced the direction of official thinking for months. Rather than accepting simple explanations, he repeatedly looked for evidence of deception hidden beneath the surface of the case. Part of Flood's concern stemmed from the unusual combination of facts confronting him. Merchant vessels were sometimes lost, crews occasionally disappeared, salvage claims were a familiar part of maritime law. What made the Mary Celeste different was that all of these elements appeared together in a manner that seemed almost too convenient. Here was a valuable ship discovered abandoned, carrying a largely intact cargo, with no surviving witnesses capable of explaining what had happened. To Flood, such circumstances demanded extraordinary scrutiny. He feared that accepting an innocent explanation too quickly might allow a crime to pass unnoticed. As testimony accumulated, the inquiry increasingly resembled an attempt to eliminate possibilities rather than confirm them. Witnesses were questioned about the ship's condition, the behaviour of the Dei Gratia crew, and the sequence of events following the discovery. Each answer resolved certain concerns while creating new uncertainties elsewhere. Rather than producing a clear narrative, the hearings exposed how little anyone truly knew about the missing days between the final logbook entry and the ship's appearance off the Azores. Before long, the men who had rescued the ship found themselves examined almost as closely as the mystery itself. The crew of the Dei Gratia had a financial interest in the salvage award that would eventually be granted for recovering the abandoned vessel. To some investigators, this fact raised uncomfortable possibilities. If the Mary Celeste represented a valuable prize, could those who discovered it have played a role in the disappearance? Suspicion naturally focused on Captain David Morehouse and his crew. They had found the vessel. They had brought it to Gibraltar. They stood to benefit financially from its recovery. In the absence of clear answers, these circumstances were enough to attract scrutiny. Repeated inspections of the vessel failed to uncover the decisive proof that investigators expected to find. Some marks discovered aboard the ship were initially interpreted as possible evidence of violence. Stains and cuts became subjects of examination. Yet closer inspection failed to establish convincing proof of murder or struggle. The cargo remained largely intact. The ship showed no reliable signs of a large-scale confrontation. No bodies were found. No credible witness linked the crew of the Dei Gratia to wrongdoing. Despite Flood's suspicions, the evidence refused to support the conclusions he seemed inclined to reach. The more thoroughly the vessel was examined, the more difficult it became to transform suspicion into proof. This failure carried practical consequences beyond the mystery itself. Because suspicion lingered throughout the proceedings, the crew of the Dei Gratia did not receive the kind of salvage award that might ordinarily be expected for recovering a vessel of such value. Although the court ultimately rejected accusations of wrongdoing, the shadow cast by the investigation remained. The rescuers left Gibraltar with compensation, but not with complete vindication. In a sense, they became some of the earliest participants in a mystery that would continue generating suspicion long after the original evidence had been exhausted. Alternative explanations gained attention as confidence in straightforward answers began to fade. Investigators considered whether Captain Briggs himself might have been involved in some form of insurance fraud. The idea rested on the possibility that the disappearance had been staged for financial gain. Such theories appeared attractive because they offered motive where other explanations offered only uncertainty. Yet they quickly encountered significant problems. Briggs enjoyed a strong professional reputation. His family had vanished alongside him. Valuable cargo remained aboard. Most importantly, no evidence emerged showing that such a scheme had actually existed. Like many theories surrounding the Mary Celeste, the insurance fraud explanation raised questions without adequately answering them. Broader accusations soon carried the inquiry into increasingly speculative territory. Mutiny theories suggested that crew members had rebelled against Captain Briggs. Piracy theories imagined attackers boarding the vessel and removing its occupants. Other explanations involved criminal conspiracies, secret violence, or deliberate deception. Each theory attempted to solve the central mystery by supplying a missing event, yet each faced the same obstacle. The physical evidence aboard the Mary Celeste rarely supported dramatic conclusions. Mutiny seemed inconsistent with the absence of clear signs of conflict. Piracy struggled to explain why valuables and cargo remained untouched. Criminal conspiracies required assumptions that could not be verified. Theories multiplied because certainty remained absent. Every avenue of investigation appeared to reveal possibilities while confirming very little. This became the defining characteristic of the inquiry. Officials could identify reasons to doubt one explanation, only to discover that competing explanations suffered from similar weaknesses. The evidence aboard the ship suggested concern but not panic. It suggested preparation but not necessarily criminal intent. It suggested a deliberate departure but not a clear motive for leaving. Investigators repeatedly found themselves returning to the same problem. There was enough information to generate suspicion, yet not enough information to establish exactly what had occurred. More than a century later, one aspect of the inquiry remains especially striking. Despite extensive examination, official authorities never reached a definitive conclusion regarding the fate of the Mary Celeste's occupants. Salvage awards were eventually granted, though reduced from what the crew of the Dei Gratia initially expected. The investigation closed without resolving the central mystery. No criminal conspiracy was proven, no act of piracy was confirmed, no fraud scheme was established. The inquiry produced documents, testimony, and theories, but it failed to produce certainty. In many ways, that failure explains why the case continues to attract attention. Had investigators found a convincing answer, the Mary Celeste might have become little more than an unusual maritime incident. Instead, the absence of resolution allowed the mystery to survive. The strongest explanations still lead back to the same uncertain decisions made aboard the Mary Celeste before its occupants disappeared. What really happened? During those 27 minutes, returning once more to the disappearance itself reveals why the case remains so difficult to close. More than a century and a half after the Mary Celeste was found drifting without a crew, investigators still find themselves drawn back to the same brief sequence of events that appears to have changed everything. The ship survived. Evidence survived. Records survived. Yet the crucial decision made aboard the vessel remains frustratingly difficult to explain with certainty. Modern historians possess far more information than the officials who examined the ship in Gibraltar, but they face the same problem. The evidence points towards several possibilities, none of which fully resolves every contradiction left behind. At the centre of every explanation stands the same unresolved question. Why would Captain Benjamin Briggs, a respected and experienced mariner, abandon a vessel that was still capable of remaining afloat? Any serious theory must account for this fact. It must explain why the cargo remained aboard, why valuables were left untouched, why navigational instruments were removed, and why the lifeboat disappeared with the occupants. It must also explain why the ship itself showed no convincing evidence of catastrophic damage. Many theories can account for some of these details. Far fewer can account for all of them simultaneously. Among contemporary interpretations, few have received more attention than the possibility that the cargo influenced the crew's decisions. The Mary Celeste carried more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, and several of those barrels were later discovered empty. Although later analysis suggested that the barrels may have leaked naturally through porous wood, those aboard the ship could not have known that with certainty. If fumes accumulated below deck, unusual odours or sounds might have created the impression that a dangerous situation was developing. In this scenario, the threat was not necessarily an explosion itself, but the belief that one might occur. Fear of a potential disaster can influence decisions just as powerfully as the disaster itself. Later examinations of the cargo introduced a detail that many researchers consider significant. In 2006, an experiment conducted for a documentary attempted to recreate conditions involving alcohol vapor and ignition. The results suggested that an explosion of vapor could occur without necessarily producing the kind of destructive fire damage many people associate with explosions. Instead, a brief flash or pressure event could create a loud and alarming disturbance, while leaving relatively little physical evidence afterward. This finding attracted attention because it offered a possible explanation for why an experienced captain might temporarily evacuate a vessel without the ship subsequently showing extensive signs of damage. Importantly, the theory does not require an actual explosion to have occurred. The perception that one might occur could have been enough. What makes this possibility especially compelling is that it addresses one of the most difficult aspects of the mystery, the apparent absence of panic aboard the ship. An actual explosion causing major structural damage would be expected to leave visible evidence behind. Fear of an explosion, however, requires no such evidence. A loud report from below deck, the smell of alcohol vapor, or signs suggesting pressure was building inside the hold could convince a prudent captain that remaining aboard carried unacceptable risk. In that scenario, the objective danger becomes less important than the danger perceived by those making decisions in real time. Researchers who favour this interpretation often emphasise that Captain Briggs was not known as a reckless man. Contemporary accounts describe him as experienced, disciplined, and deeply respected within maritime circles. The decision to leave a vessel under his command therefore becomes easier to understand if it is viewed as an act of caution rather than panic. The mystery is not that Briggs acted irrationally. The mystery is that a rational decision may have been based upon conditions that later investigators could no longer fully reconstruct. Questions surrounding the ship's condition provide another important piece of the puzzle. Water found in the bilge and concerns involving the vessel's pumps have generated discussion for decades. If Captain Briggs believed the pumps were not functioning correctly, he may have struggled to determine how much water was actually present below deck. The missing sounding rod suggests that measurements of the bilge may have played a role in decision-making during the final phase of the voyage. A captain confronted with uncertain readings, malfunctioning equipment, and a cargo capable of generating concern might reasonably conclude that the vessel's condition was deteriorating more rapidly than it truly was. In that context, caution becomes easier to understand. Location may have shaped the situation in ways that are easy to overlook today. By the time the final events unfolded, the Mary Celeste had reached the waters around the Azores. While still surrounded by open ocean, the ship was considerably closer to land than it had been during much of the Atlantic crossing. This fact may have influenced risk calculations aboard the vessel. A captain who believed assistance or landfall was relatively accessible might view temporary evacuation differently than he would in the middle of the ocean. Proximity to the Azores did not eliminate danger, but it may have contributed to a belief that leaving the ship briefly was manageable under the circumstances. Environmental conditions deserve consideration even when they fail to provide a complete solution. Weather has often been proposed as a factor in the disappearance, though not necessarily in the form of a dramatic storm. Moderate seas, changing winds, and shifting conditions could all complicate efforts to assess the vessel's situation accurately. They could also increase the risks associated with maintaining a connection between a lifeboat and a larger sailing vessel. Importantly, weather does not need to be extreme to influence events. Many maritime accidents result not from extraordinary conditions, but from the interaction of ordinary conditions with existing uncertainties and human decisions. Difficulties emerge whenever a single theory is asked to account for every known fact. Alcohol vapor concerns explain why a captain might fear remaining aboard. Pump problems help explain anxiety regarding the vessel's condition. Weather offers context for why a temporary evacuation might become dangerous. Yet none of these explanations, considered alone, fully resolves the mystery. The vapor theory does not explain every detail involving the ship's equipment. Pump concerns do not fully explain the removal of navigational instruments. Weather alone struggles to explain the orderly nature of the abandonment. Each theory illuminates part of the puzzle while leaving other pieces in shadow. For that reason, many modern assessments favour a sequence involving multiple overlapping concerns. Rather than imagining a single dramatic cause, they propose a convergence of factors. Captain Briggs may have been worried about the cargo. He may have received uncertain information regarding water levels. He may have lacked confidence in the pumps. He may have believed conditions justified a temporary move into the lifeboat while remaining close to the ship. None of these concerns alone would necessarily require abandonment. Together, however, they create a situation in which an experienced captain might choose caution over certainty. Such reconstructions remain speculative, but they fit many of the known facts more comfortably than theories built around a single event. This layered approach also helps explain why the mystery has gradually shifted away from dramatic theories involving pirates, sea monsters, or elaborate conspiracies. While such ideas captured public imagination for generations, they often require assumptions unsupported by the evidence. Modern interpretations tend to move in the opposite direction. Rather than introducing extraordinary events, they focus on ordinary maritime concerns interacting in an unfortunate sequence. A questionable sounding, uncertainty regarding the pumps, concerns about cargo vapours, changing weather, and a temporary evacuation plan may sound less dramatic than earlier theories, yet they align more closely with the clues left aboard the vessel. Even so, plausibility should not be mistaken for proof. Historians can identify explanations that fit the evidence reasonably well, but they cannot demonstrate exactly which concerns influence Briggs most strongly. The surviving clues reveal possibilities rather than certainties. That distinction remains crucial because the final decision aboard the Mary Celeste was shaped by information available to the people present, not by the information available to historians examining the case decades later. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Mary Celeste is that evidence and certainty are not always the same thing. Historians possess more information about this case than many maritime mysteries of the 19th century. They know the vessel's route, they know the cargo, they know the identities of those aboard, they know where the ship was discovered and what condition it was in. Yet one critical element remains inaccessible: the perceptions of the people making decisions during the final moments aboard. Evidence can reveal what existed around them. It cannot fully reveal what they believed. And in many emergencies, human decisions are shaped less by objective reality than by the understanding of reality available at the time. The disappearance endures because the final decision aboard the Mary Celeste appears simultaneously understandable and inexplicable. Modern explanations can show how a cautious captain might have become concerned. They can demonstrate how uncertainty regarding cargo, water levels, or equipment could influence judgment. They can even reconstruct a plausible sequence leading to temporary evacuation. What they cannot do is eliminate every doubt. Somewhere between the evidence recovered from the ship and the experience of those who left it lies a gap that history has never managed to close. That gap is where the mystery survives. Somewhere between what Captain Briggs believed was happening and what was actually happening, the Mary Celeste carried its answer beyond the reach of history.